EA recently closed down Visceral Games, the San Francisco-based studio responsible for the Dead Space series. Their latest, now cancelled project was an action-adventure Star Wars game in the vein of the Uncharted franchise, and now that the smoke is clearing, we're starting to find out more about what the game was and why it got canned. According to this fantastic tell-all article, which I highly recommend you read for yourself, there's a link in the description, the project fell apart for a whole host of reasons, but one big reason seems to be how ambitious Visceral's plans were. The suits at EA wanted the game to compete directly with games like Uncharted 4, so they were looking for graphical fidelity on par with that game. The issue was that Visceral wasn't at all equipped to make that game. Aside from the fact that they didn't have enough manpower and EA's proprietary Frostbite engine wasn't really built for third-person action games, Visceral's team hadn't ever made something like this. As the article points out, when a game studio tries to make something new, it's usually a rough first attempt that lays the groundwork for something a lot better. The team gets to go through a full development cycle, start to finish, and then they can leverage all of that experience they've gained to make an even better product. The EA folks wanted Visceral to leapfrog a decade of experience and make a game superior to the ones that Naughty Dog had been fine-tuning for years with less than half the staff, in less time, and with inferior tools. Tricky math here, I know, but some of you may be noticing that this equation doesn't really add up. I think this story perfectly encapsulates one of the most crippling obsessions that the modern game industry has, chasing after the best cutting-edge graphics. Games have become more complex, which has led to much longer dev cycles and much higher production costs. And this drastic increase in time and money isn't yielding proportional results on the technology side. Nowadays, games have really, really good graphics, but they only get better slowly, incrementally, and every inch of improvement is costing these companies a fortune.
And the graphics. That's really what this is all about.
Games this generation have taken longer to come out and cost more money to make, but the actual improvements that we're seeing in the visuals are more and more negligible. Let me just remind you that The Last of Us was a PlayStation 3 game. This came out 4 years ago. Grand Theft Auto 5 was initially released on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. The current gen version is a port. Metal Gear Solid 5 and Persona 5 both got releases on old hardware, and it's not like those versions of the games are hard to look at. Games that aren't using up-to-the-minute cutting-edge technology don't have to look bad. Some current-gen games can look great on current hardware and still function as intended on old hardware. There doesn't really seem to be a downside to doing it that way, but clearly there's a downside to constantly pursuing perfection. Look at what's happened to Square Enix in recent years. Making games has become more challenging, so they just double down and try to make the most ambitious games of all time with no build-up. Naughty Dog's Uncharted 1 and Square's Final Fantasy XIII were both unveiled at E3 2006. Uncharted 1 came out a year later, and then Uncharted 2 came out in 2009, several months ahead of Final Fantasy XIII's eventual December 2009 release. Final Fantasy XIII is a longer game than Uncharted 2, and it certainly looks nice, but really, is the difference in visual quality here so extreme that taking an extra 2 years to get to market was worth it? Naughty Dog had turned out 2 7th-generation games in the time that it took Square Enix to release 1. That on its own doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it had lasting consequences. By the end of the PlayStation 3's life cycle, Naughty Dog released Uncharted 3 and The Last of Us, both of which set new technical milestones and sold a bajillion units. Square Enix, on the other hand, squeezed out 2 games that used the same engine as 13, heavily recycled assets from that game, looked and ran worse than their predecessor, and sold, we're gonna say, poorly. Compared to Naughty Dog, Square's staff didn't get to go through as many cycles of iteration. They didn't get to jump back into a brand new large-scale project and improve upon their method. They essentially made one game, fiddled around with that game 2 more times, and then had to move on to totally new technology and hardware. Speaking of, this generation, Square turned out Final Fantasy XV, which admittedly looks nice and sold very well, but for all the time and money they spent developing a brand new engine, they didn't push the bar forward. They didn't blow anybody's mind. So was all that work, all that cash, worth it? Then you compare that situation to something like Xenoblade Chronicles. As ambitious as Final Fantasy XIII was, Xenoblade just blew it out of the water in terms of scale, in terms of length, in terms of activities you could engage in. I mean, this game is bonkers. It's such a massive undertaking, way bigger than Final Fantasy XIII. But Monolith Soft isn't nearly as big a developer as Square Enix, so how'd they manage it? Oh, they made it for the Wii, so it looked like you were watching the entire thing over dial-up internet. But it worked! They didn't have to waste their time and money making every single texture look good in HD. There was no way Monolith Soft could have built a game of this scale and made their money back if they'd tried to develop something that met the demanding standards of PS3 and 360 games, so they just didn't even try. and the game was better for it. Square and other companies with similar mindsets seem determined to come out of the gate with titles that will redefine the gaming landscape, but they don't allow their staff a chance to find their sea legs with an awkward first attempt. Today, Square is working really hard to keep updating Final Fantasy XV and make new content for it, and good for them. They clearly care about their product. But what's interesting is that you can see the cycles of learning that Square initially skipped playing out across the DLC. Remember what they showed in those early trailers? What they thought they would be able to build on their first attempt at a game like this? Nope. It's just a big awkward mess. Now, about a year later, they're putting out a new DLC chapter for the game, and whoa! Well, this is hands down one of the most technically impressive things in the whole game. It's almost like the team has had the chance to complete a couple development cycles and learn how to use their new toolset. Looking at this might make you think, boy, this team's next PS4 game is gonna be pretty neat. And in interviews, the director has said that they're gonna keep making new content for this game until the end of 2018, at which point they'll start working on a totally new project for the next generation of hardware. So the staff at Square tried to make their most ambitious game ever on their first try with new technology, and just as they're getting comfortable working for this platform, they're switching to totally new technology to make another, even bigger, more ambitious game. No, it's perfect, carry on, I don't even care anymore. Chasing perfection without the chance to iterate is killing these games. Persona 5 seems to have gone through a similar situation. That game was supposed to come out in 2014, but didn't release until late 2016, and remember, that's one of the games that also runs just fine on last-gen hardware. Here's a thought. What if they made a miniature spin-off Persona game, like one that was 15 or 20 hours long instead of 120, and sold it for $40? People would have gobbled it up, and the staff would have gained important experience that they could reapply to their super ambitious project. This actually isn't that uncommon. We've seen several developers do something like this in recent years. And think about it, these are the successes. Visceral didn't get to turn out a game at all. Their project just crashed and burned. How many other projects have never seen the light of day or otherwise didn't meet their publisher's expectations because they were chasing after absurd standards without being prepared for the task? And do you want to know the best part of all this?
It doesn't matter!
Y'all know Mario, right? You remember when he used to look like this? Then after a couple of iterations, he looked like this. Whoa, he looks less like a bunch of blocks shoved together and more like a real cartoon character. He's starting to look like those illustrations from Nintendo Power. And then Nintendo said, nah, you ain't seen nothing yet. This is the past. You wanna see the future? Oh my goodness, the surgery. It worked. He's perfect. And then a little while later, Nintendo was all like, nah, son, that was a dry run. You really think that's a Mario? You ain't never seen a Mario. This is a Mario. All three of these were huge leaps. The kinds of leaps that would get you excited, that would get you to run out to a game store or Blockbuster to see what the new technology was offering. But again, that was the old. That's like 2002 old. Hillary Clinton wasn't even president yet.
Pokemon go to the polls.
So, it's been more than a decade. Let's go see what Mario looks like now, 15 years later. What are you cooked up for us, Nintendo? Oh, he looks the same. I mean, yeah, his hair is more detailed and there's actual stitching on his overalls, so that's all cool, but really? A decade of development for this? There were barely 5 years between these two. What happened, Nintendo? That may seem like an unfair example because Mario is so cartoony, but apply the same logic to Nathan Drake from Uncharted 1. 2007, this game. I mean, it doesn't look bad, right? Now, 9 years later, Uncharted 4. Yes, there's certainly noticeable improvement, but does this feel revolutionary compared to this? Is this game-changing? He was perfectly expressive before, he looked like a normal human being. Progress on CGI is so incremental now that we never see big leaps in the technology. And since we don't see big leaps anymore, that means that incredible visuals can't really surprise or wow us. This isn't to say that we can't be impressed by graphics, but I don't think that anything truly sells on visual fidelity anymore. The last time anything sold on the merits of its graphics was Avatar. Remember, Avatar? An aesthetic style, cool art direction, these are all things that can get us to buy something. But we're so saturated with incredible graphics now, we're so used to seeing games look this good that if you bought games because they had incredible graphics, you'd have to buy basically every other AAA game that comes out. This isn't helped by the fact that consumers don't trust developers anymore when it comes to their visuals. We've been burned one too many times with trailers and demos that look way better than the final product, games that supposedly had to be next gen, but obviously didn't. What a joke.
Do you want to talk about development of Knack and why this game had to be next generation?
the 5,000 part physics simulation. Picks up the parts from the environment and he incorporates them into his body. A 3-foot tall sort of mascot style character that maybe has only 60 parts, and he can be a 30-foot rampaging monster. In that case, it's about 5,000 parts in his body. It has a very sort of Transformers the movie feel to it.
You hear that, everybody? The game that you're currently seeing on screen, Knack, had to be next generation because Knack is made up of 56,7,200 kajillion individual assets. Permission to speak freely? What if he just wasn't made up of 56,7,200 kajillion individual assets?
No, that's absurd.
I don't want to do this, but going back to Square again because they're like the poster child for this issue. Apparently, one of the 3 main pillars of the Final Fantasy franchise is cutting-edge technology. In a 2012 interview, Square's technical director said that he thinks Square Enix exists because of the high end. Okay, let me explain something to you guys because I don't think you've quite figured it out yet. You have sold exactly 3 Final Fantasy games on the merits of their technology. You made 6 games that sold well and had great art direction but weren't technical powerhouses. Then you made a game that Sony threw a bajillion-dollar marketing campaign behind, all built around the promise that this was the most technologically advanced movie-like game ever made.
And now, the most anticipated epic adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you. Final Fantasy VII.
Then you made Final Fantasy VIII, which looked even better and had similar marketing. All the commercials were like, yeah, can you believe this is a video game?
An epic so stunning, your emotions will stir, your heart will race, and your thumbs will be really, really sore. Final Fantasy VIII, coming to a home theater near you. PlayStation.
But if you watch the trailers for 9, suddenly it's all about the story and the characters, even though 9 had the best technology of all 3. 9 is the best looking of the PlayStation trilogy, fight me. They didn't push the tech in their marketing anymore because it was no longer a novel thing. The likes of Silent Hill and Metal Gear Solid were all making movie games, so there wasn't anything truly unique about Final Fantasy's approach anymore. Then 10 came out early in the PS2's life cycle, had full voice acting, and looked really good. I don't have a hard time believing that people bought this game on the merits of its tech because that generation was a real step change, as we discussed earlier with Mario. You'll also notice that, unlike in recent years, they got to market early. That game launched barely a year after the system did. By the time that Final Fantasy XII came out, though, I mean, this game looks good. It's making the PS2 chug for all it's worth, but how many people really appreciated that when the Xbox 360 was already out? Then Final Fantasy XIII came out, and yeah, gorgeous game, incredibly polished, but in 2009 you could also get Assassin's Creed 2, Arkham Asylum, Uncharted 2, Modern Warfare 2, Killzone 2, Grand Theft Auto 4 got its second expansion pack, and, as if to further prove that the entire graphics rat race was totally pointless, the first version of Minecraft came out. Plus, remember that 13 didn't release internationally until March of 2010, and by that point, Heavy Rain was out. I think my favorite example of Square's graphics silliness is going on with the Kingdom Hearts team. They had to go from working on the PSP and the 3DS to the PS4. They skipped 2 generations of development know-how, and yet the back of the box for Kingdom Hearts 2.8 proudly brags about how this game is the next evolution in Kingdom Hearts graphics. What? What does that mean? What does that mean? Not an evolution of graphics, just an evolution by the standards of Kingdom Hearts' graphics. Okay? Who cares? They're asking this team to turn out bragging rights-worthy visuals 4 years into the current console generation, and even when they brag about it, they're only bragging about it by their own internal standards. So the only people who would even understand what that means or care are the super hardcore fans who are gonna buy it anyway. The big back of the box feature for this 2017 game is that the graphics in this entry are better than the graphics from the last entry. What are you doing? Don't get me wrong, this game looks very nice, but just picture this. If someone is standing in GameStop and they're the particular breed of shallow that really bases their purchasing decisions on the quality of a game's graphics, do you really think that they're gonna grab this game when, I don't know, Horizon Zero Dawn or The Witcher 3 or Uncharted 4 or that game about the werewolves or whatever are on the same PS4 shelf just a few inches away? They're asking their staff to make these huge leaps, but for what? One of the pillars of their company is something that everyone is good at now. EA thought that Visceral's Star Wars game needed to have the best graphics ever to succeed. Hey, morons! It's a Star Wars game! People would buy a box full of human excrement if it had a Star Wars logo on it.
Check it out, everybody. I've got a copy of Uncharted 4, the current gold standard for visuals in video games. Let's have a look at the back of the box, shall we? Oh, what's that? Oh, what's that? There's nothing anywhere about the visual fidelity? Oh no! It's ruined!
And even if a company was just releasing games that flat out looked better than everyone else's, the best part is that no one cares anymore. By and large, I don't think that consumers today really care about how a game looks. As long as it doesn't look like this. People are buying more and more indie games, games with retro throwback art styles, games that can run on previous gen hardware, and games that can run on their phones. Battlegrounds is shattering sales and concurrent player count records left and right, and it's not exactly on the bleeding edge of graphics technology. People make fun of BioWare's games for having weak artificial character animation, but those complaints haven't stopped them from buying 14 million copies of the Mass Effect games. Publishers keep talking about making the next big esports game. They seem to think that there's a lot of money to be made there. But what are the biggest esports games right now? Well, we've got Counter-Strike Global Offensive, a game that runs on the Source engine. And oh yeah, there's League of Legends, which is really pushing the envelope in the visual department. If games don't sell because of their graphics anymore, then I've gotta ask, if a given game looked a bit worse than these absurd standards the industry keeps setting for itself, would consumers even care? I don't think so, and the industry seems to agree with me because they keep churning out HD ports of games from a generation, heck, 2 generations ago. The HD remaster of Final Fantasy XII looks good. If Final Fantasy XV had looked slightly better than this, the game would have been out sooner, cost less, and probably would have had way more content. It probably would have had that second continent, and I don't think anybody would have cared how it looked. It's cool that developers want to make these cutting-edge games, but I think they're wasting their time and their money. If I was magically made the big boss of AAA games, I'd have developers get their feet wet with a small product that they spend 1 year developing, to completion, and put out for like 20 or 30 bucks. They go through a complete cycle of learning, creating, and finally publishing, so they have the experience they need to dive into a bigger project with a lot of the potential snags nipped in the bud ahead of time. And these games that they're creating don't have to look perfect. Unless we're talking about a team like Crytek, where graphics are their whole thing, who cares if the game doesn't look cutting edge? Like, really, do you care? Do you, currently watching this video, care if your games look like this? I'm actually asking here, there's a poll down in the description because I want to know. If a game came out in the year 2018 that looked like Uncharted 1, but had a higher resolution, better anti-aliasing, and ran at a rock-solid frame rate with no screen tearing, would that be a deal breaker? Would you care? If it was a game that you were interested in anyway, would it matter to you in the slightest? Because if that doesn't matter to you, then the team developing that game can probably make it twice as fast and for half the cost that they would if they were trying to wow you with thousands of individually animated strands of hair. I know that asking this question after the video is inherently biasing, so I'm not trying to get conclusive scientific numbers here, but I am legitimately curious. Am I just crazy? Or does my impression of the modern game consumer have some validity? Because if it does, then I think some of these folks could be making a lot more money for a lot less work. Wow, you made it all the way to the end. If you liked it, I've made some other videos you could watch. Might be worth your time. I don't know. Also, all of our playthrough stuff has officially left this channel and moved over to our second channel, Research Runs. So if you care about our playthrough stuff, you may want to go check that out, or not. I can't really tell you what to do. I'm not your dad. Please do participate in the poll, though. That would be greatly appreciated.